Okay. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Rebecca Eisted. I work for the Forestry Commission. I'm the Squirrel Advisor. I'm going to be supported in this presentation today by my colleague Jay Doyle, who's the ecologist in our team, and he's busy admitting our latecomers. So he'll hear from you shortly. So I wanted to start this presentation with a big thank you. This isn't just mine and Jay's work. It's been supported by the UK Squirrel Accord, particularly their Red Squirrel Conservation Group. The UK Squirrel Accord is a UK-wide partnership of 43 leading conservation organisations, both forestry and land management organisations, government agencies and companies. And I'd like to give particular thanks to those who gave their time and expertise to develop this guidance, but especially Craig Shuttleworth and Louise Derard, who shared some of their pre-publication research to make sure we had the latest information. So what's the purpose of this guidance? It's advice about how to plan and carry out forestry operations in woodlands to minimise possible impacts on red squirrels. It's aimed at foresters carrying out work or planning work in woodlands in England. This isn't best practice on how to manage a woodland for red squirrels. There is some advice to get you started if that's what you want to do, but the focus is about how to plan and carry out forestry operations in woodlands with red squirrels, and it is applicable to England. So red squirrels are an endangered species and they're protected by the law. It's protected under the Wildlife and Countryside Act, listed on Schedule 5. They're also listed as species of principal importance for conservation under the Natural Environment Rural Communities, the NERC Act, and that's a priority species. They're also covered by the recent Environment Act, which includes a legally binding target on species abundance for 2030, which is intended to reverse declines of priority species, and that includes red squirrels. But what does the Act actually say about their protection? So it's an offence to intentionally or recklessly kill, injure or take a red squirrel, to damage or destroy or obstruct access to any structure or place where a red squirrel uses for shelter or protection, or to disturb a red squirrel while it's occupying one of those structures. And anyone who does that knowingly causes or permits these acts could be committing an offence. So what does damage and disturbance mean? Damage or destruction of actively used drays, whether the squirrel's inside at the time or not. For breeding drays, there's a risk of young squirrels being killed or injured if a dray tree is felled. But it could also be obstruction to access of used drays. This is less likely, but I suppose it could occur, for example, where a branch fell from a neighbouring tree and got lodged against the dray. Disturbance offences relate to the animals occupying the dray. So a squirrel is inside the dray when an operation occurs. Disturbance might occur without any damage, for example, when nearby trees are felled. But the damage and disturbance impacts will depend on the scale of available habitat, the scale of the operation that's planned, and whether that habitat is linked to other areas of suitable habitat. And research has shown that sort of standard thinning operations have minimal impacts on red squirrels, even during the breeding season. And the strength of those offences suggests that you can't do anything in a woodland, but that's not helpful. It's not useful, because actually managing our forests ensures there's a ongoing supply of food and materials for the red squirrels to use and to survive in those woodlands. So management is an important part of red squirrel habitat. But the focus for this, for much of this guidance, is on the felling work, particularly clear felling, because that's where most impacts are likely to occur. If an offence does occur, it's important that you are able to demonstrate that you took reasonable precautions to avoid causing damage and disturbance. That's where the reckless element comes in. And it's your responsibility to ensure that your actions and anyone you're contracting onto your land follows the law. I just remind people about muting their microphones. Thank you. In this guidance, we have this flow diagram that accompanies and kind of summarises the guidance and the thinking processes needed. We'll come back to this at each turn to talk about each of the steps. But first, we wanted to give you a bit more context about the red squirrel, where they are and what's important for reds in forests and what's happening at different times of the year, so you can understand where the forestry impacts might occur. And my colleague Jay is going to talk to these slides.
Thanks, Rebecca. So, folks, you can see from the mapping that the red squirrel is distributed largely in the north of England. On the left-hand side there, you'll see the areas in red, which are the areas inhabited only by red squirrel. Areas in orange, where you have both red and grey. And then the bulk of England, which is dominated by greys only, with obviously outliers further south in England, in the sort of Lancashire, Formby area, parts of Yorkshire, beyond the sort of the core northern area of Cumbria, Northumberland, and then further south we have the isolated populations on the Isle of Wight and Brownsea. But if you look over towards the right-hand figure, the situation in the core area within England of Northern England, this data provided by the Red Squirrels, Northern England and Northern Red Squirrels from 2021, shows that even within that core range within England, the situation is rather patchy. So where in the forest are red squirrels likely to be? Well, I think the first thing to talk about really is the area, the fact that, if you have a larger forest or woodland block that is well connected, that generally speaking will be more hospitable to red squirrel populations, and sort of contrast that with a much smaller area of woodland or forest that is somewhat isolated. But of key importance is to have that diversity of tree species and forest structure to provide food and shelter. Now, moving forward into the future, it's likely that forests are going to be far more diverse in terms of their species composition, but also in terms of their structure as well, as we adopt different silvicultural systems. So in that sense, that is going to be a positive development, whether you're thinking of restructuring existing forests or in terms of the design of new forests that Rebecca will touch on later. But crucially, to have a connected canopy with good profuse understory, and of course sites where the squirrels themselves can build their drays, and that often is the sort of the split sort of limbs in the top of trees. Okay, Rebecca, I think we can move on there. Brilliant. So what we wanted to touch on was the Red Squirrel Year. Now, of course, forest operations can have an impact on red squirrels throughout the year, but by considering where we are within the red squirrel annual cycle, we can take a risk-based approach and look to minimise our operational impacts through sound planning. So, in discussion with experts, and Louise and I have sort of come up with the guidance that suggests that between February and September, that is likely to be the most sensitive time of the year, and really that hinges on the period when the young squirrels are most dependent upon the adult squirrels. So we're looking at that sort of peak of the birthing in February, as you'll see in that middle part of the top figure, and that extending into the peak of the weaning period, into sort of late September, early October. So I think that's really important, considering where you are working in terms of that sort of season. Now, of course, what we really must consider is that, as we know, there's been an earlier onset of spring with climate change. But from one year to the next, seasonality can have a big effect on potentially how early the birthing period may commence, but also how late. On a year where you have a particular cold snap, this can shift. And likewise, that will have a knock-on effect on that weaning period. So you do have to take note of year-to-year sort of situations in terms of seasonality. Okay, thanks, Rebecca.
Okay, so back to this flow diagram, you can see in the top left, there's a diamond that says, are the squirrels present in this area? How do you know? Well, if you know for definite, you can move on to the planning stage and we'll talk about that. If you know they're definitely not there, you can proceed with your planned management. But if you don't know, how would you find out? Well, there's some details in the guidance about how you could go about finding out, but I wanted to highlight a couple of them in particular. So some of you may have come across the Magic interactive map. Has all sorts of information in there on all sorts of biodiversity, but within the countryside stewardship targeting layers, which is it has a layer for red squirrels, and it shows you these lovely orange blobs. This is an area around Penrith, and it's showing you the darker colours are areas that have been highlighted as red squirrel reserves. We know there are strong populations of red squirrels around there, but all this area around it is where they have been sighted. So you can zoom in on this map to sort of see where your site fits. But if you're still not sure, you can use local knowledge. Across most of the north of England, northern red squirrels have community groups that are involved in the conservation and management of red squirrels, and they have a lot of information about the populations that are there. If you go onto their website, the link is in the guidance. You can get in touch with them to find out what they know about the populations in your local area. And if you know that you're nearby, or that you have them within the area, but you don't know where exactly within your forest that they are, you should conduct some kind of a survey. So there's initial surveys to identify the presence, whether that's animal sightings, setting up camera traps. And there are different sites of survey for different situations, and there's more detail on all these different types of survey and when to use them in the guidance itself. The feeding signs and dray surveys will tell you have squirrels, but not whether they are red or grey. These other surveys can clarify which type of squirrel you have. And the feeding signs in particular are useful for pre-operational checks because they show that the squirrels are right there now. If you use feeder-based surveys, it's really important to consider disease transfer risks if you have both red and grey squirrels. And any equipment that you're using that red squirrels can sit on and grey squirrels can sit on, you should use an antiviral disinfectant. Virkon is the recommended one. And it's essential that those are cleaned on a regular basis so that minimise any disease transfer. And the main thing to consider here is that those pre-operational checks are essential before carrying out your work, so you know whether you've got squirrels active in your patch of woodland. But whichever method is used, we know from recent research there's no certain way of finding all the strays or squirrels in a wood. And for some types of forest, visual surveys, even by experienced ecologists, will only find a small proportion of drays. And thermal imaging has recently been described to me as a game changer. You can't tell the species from it, but you can see squirrels in canopies that would otherwise be invisible from the ground. So it could be a useful tool. So you've established that you have red squirrels in the woodland and that they are in the area for planning felling. What's next? So management, as we said before, can be beneficial when carried out with red squirrels in mind. So this is kind of the most important phase of the operation, working out what happens when and doing it at the right time of year where practical to reduce the impacts. So you're planning and carrying out operations to minimise the impact, and zoning and timing the operations to reduce the risk of significant damage or disturbance. So what do you need to take into account? Firstly, the time of year when you're going to be working. Although harvesting might disturb squirrels and damage drays at any time, the potential impacts are much higher during the breeding season. So we recommend avoiding clear felling in the February to September period, and certainly in the period up to the end of June where the first litter is being weaned. The second factor is the type and scale of operation. As we've mentioned, clear felling and large group fellings will have the biggest impacts, or likely to. So you might need to retain small clumps of unfelled trees around drays that you've identified within those areas. But equally, we acknowledge that those are likely to blow over on exposed or wet sites, so it may not be practical or effective for red conservation to retain them. And as we said before, in unthinned Sitka spruce plantations, drays may be almost impossible to find before trees are felled. Fortunately, within those forests, squirrels also live at very low density populations. So considering that the area that you fell at any one time will also help reduce any impact. Thinning operations have been shown to have minimal impact during the breeding season, but they have the potential to disturb. And although disturbing of foraging animals on the floor is lawful, it's best practice to minimise any disturbance. So again, consider splitting your thinning operations over very large sites into smaller sections and thin in different years. If you want to go further, you could also consider the management regime you're using. You could shift from a clear or block fell towards a more continuous cover type approach. This will generate less disturbance because you're maintaining the canopy, and therefore the connectivity allows squirrels to move around. And you're also likely to result in improved habitat in future by producing a mix of age classes for continuity of food sources. Then thirdly, the location of the operation. Where in your forest is this happening? Is it close to other suitable habitat for feeding and sheltering to which squirrels can escape? And also think about the order of the work. So make sure that when you are carrying out felling, you're felling towards areas of suitable habitat, not creating islands where squirrels are trapped and can't get themselves across the canopy to somewhere else. Where you find dray trees, they should be marked and left unfelled, preferably with immediately adjacent trees and ideally with an arboreal connection. You should make every effort to avoid accidental loss and damage to dray trees. But of course, we know this isn't always possible. And it's not just the forest blocks. Your ride management can be really significant too. So some rides allow connectivity at canopy level, and that can help squirrels move through the forest. So retaining some of those points as you do your ride management can be really helpful. But where you can't retain canopy connections, then having patches of scrub that cross the ride can allow cover for squirrels moving through. So once you've done all the planning, you're moving down to carrying out your operation. So you need to, shortly before you do your operation, you need to do the pre-operational checks for checking whether your squirrels have moved into an area where you previously thought they hadn't. This should be within 2 weeks of the operations, because obviously your planning might have been done some months before. And it's really important that the people carrying out the work, your harvesting operatives, should be trained to look for protected species, and red squirrels in particular, as you're moving through this woodland. As Jay mentioned earlier, fork trees, particularly in Norway spruce and larch, should be treated with caution as they're favoured dray trees. If you've come across red squirrels and drays during operations, you should stop work, leave the tree standing, consider whether to delay or relocate operations. But as a minimum, record all the incidents and the action you took when red squirrels or their drays were encountered during operations. If you're not sure what to do in that situation, the red squirrel groups could potentially provide advice. So that's why we really recommend you developing an active relationship with that group so that they are able to provide you with short notice support if you need it. But it's not just about felling. There are other operations, other things that happen in woodlands that have the potential to cause damage or disturbance. Think about the same considerations as with felling, so the time of year where something's happening, the location, and the scale at which it's happening. So you may be stacking timber for later removal, and if this is a very isolated wood where this doesn't happen very often, be mindful of where your drays are and keep it away from drays. So if you're going to be collecting, you do your harvesting out of the breeding season, but you might be doing your collecting during the breeding season, you won't be disturbing. Same with large recreational events. They're usually a one-off. Don't hold those in areas of prime squirrel habitat. And also consider, if you're developing your woodland, your forest with new access infrastructure, whether that's for management operations, for public recreation, as far as possible, sort of keep those away from high priority areas to reduce disturbance. There's some evidence of habituation, so squirrels getting used to operations. So if you already have areas of high public access and regularly used forest roads, there's no requirement to change that or move that. It's just being mindful about new introductions. We've mentioned several times about keeping records. We've produced this checklist. It's Annex 4 in the guidance, separate link on the website. And it guides you through this thought process of the flowchart that we've just been talking through. And it gives you an opportunity to record what you've done. You might be familiar with this if you've been, it's an evolution of our European Protected Species checklist. So you may be familiar with using it. We also recommend that immediately prior to woodland management operations, you do an operational site assessment. And there's, again, on our website, a form for that, which is linked to from the guidance. And that's been developed with to help woodland owners and managers consider the potential impacts of their operations, not just on protected species. And it's good practice to follow them. So there are lots of things you can also do in your forest to provide better habitat and year-round food sources. The best thing, one of the best things you can do is to have a long-term plan for your woodland. So you can take into account all the factors we've been talking about, and allows you to take the opportunities for improvement that match your other management objectives, such as diversifying your stands and maybe considering your management methods. It'll also help you take into account other protected species and habitats more effectively, because obviously red squirrels are likely not to be the only protected species you have in your forest. And better habitat across the whole forest block might help offset any short-term effects on individual squirrels from felling trees or other management, and will make an important contribution to the recovery of the species in the longer term. Evidence of planning in this way will also help demonstrate a reasonable and responsible approach to your protection duties. But the other main thing you can do is effective grey squirrel management. Is one of the most important measures that forestry managers can put in place to benefit red squirrels. Creating grey squirrel free zones allows red squirrel population to expand. So in summary, make sure you have a forest plan that considers the presence of red squirrels. Make sure you've made the effort to detect red squirrels and locate their drays. Avoid felling during the peak season, this February to September window. Consider whether there's available suitable habitat nearby to which squirrels might move. And leave connective links when planning harvesting, because squirrels like to move through the trees, not across the ground. Always carry out the pre-operational check and mark any dray trees to help your harvesters know where to avoid, as well as instructing them what to look out for. Leave dray trees standing and consider supporting that so it's not an isolated tree. If you encounter squirrels, consider whether you should move your operations elsewhere and make sure you record any incidents. There are places to find out more. Of the top link, we'll make sure these links are circulated. The top link is to the guidance that's on Gov.uk. If you just Google red squirrels and forestry operations, you'll find it, and it has a lot more detail about all the things I've just talked through. If you want to know more about how to support red squirrel conservation, the UK Squirrel Accord is a good place to start. There's lots of information on their website and lots of links to other organisations, individuals that can help, as well as the Woodland Wildlife Toolkit, which is hosted on the Silver website. That has links to all sorts of other wildlife that you might find in your woodland and has reference sheets for what to do to benefit them. So now we'll come over to the questions. So Jack has asked, is there going to be any updates to the guidance in regards to future research at all? Absolutely. This we've taken account of the most recent research, but if there are new findings that suggest this guidance needs to be amended, we can do that. Any other questions? In terms of the participant, Nick Leeming's asked, do I have any idea of the participants on the call? How many are foresters? How many are red squirrel people? I have a list of, we have access to the list of people that have attended, but I think there's both. There's a good mixture of both from looking through the list. And we plan to do some further communications to make sure this does get out to all the people that need it. So Eddie's asked about recklessness and what's the nuance about larch being felled on a plant health notice. That's a good question. One that I don't have a good answer to. It's when a plant health notice requires sanitary felling, there is a degree of flexibility about the timing of when that can happen, and that should be discussed with the woodland officers issuing the notice to take account of protected species in that situation.
Rebecca, I see a question from Katie Bell coming through from the Ulster Wildlife Trust, and in relation to, has there been a positive response from those involved in working on the ground? And I think it's true to say that certainly feedback through such organisations as Red Squirrel Northern England is that actually there's been definitely a sort of a positive feedback, and certainly a great desire within the sector as well to have this guidance and for folks to ultimately be doing the right thing. This isn't about obviously managing woods for red squirrels, but it's about managing woods with red squirrels in mind. And of course, but by adopting this guidance, we can make quite a significant contribution towards conserving the existing populations of red squirrels.
Thanks, Jay. So there's a couple of questions about managing grey squirrels. There is guidance we've recently produced about all the different management methods. You can find that on Gov.uk, but also through the UK Squirrel Accord. If you spot grey squirrels on a site where you've previously only seen red, there are links through Northern Red Squirrels to report that, and their conservation groups will help you deal with it. Or
Rebecca, there was a question from Kezia on the larch removal situation and recommended species. And I would refer Kezia and folks to the appendices, where we provide advice about suitable species. But also, depending on where you are in England, I'd advise you look at the ecological site classification resources on the Forest Research website, which can give you sort of more detailed information about what would be suitable in your part of the country or particular part of the country, but also that some of that information involves sort of consideration of climate change as well, and a view to the future as well. And I'll pop that in the link, Kezia.
Yeah, there's a question about the fate of litters in drays where dray trees left. Jay, do you have any information about that? You're on mute.
Just go back. If you could just repeat that question, Rebecca.
But there's a question about is there any research on the fate of litters in drays where dray trees been left after felling?
That is something that I'm not cited on. I must be honest there, but we will look into that and perhaps circulate the information after this meeting.
Yeah. So there's a question about timber supply, and I think the point to emphasize there is, although this is quite a big window that we're asking people to be mindful of the impacts on red squirrel populations are very patchy. The red squirrels also live at very low density within woodlands, max sort of around 1 per hectare and lower. So within any one forest block, there will be lots of opportunities for felling to be able to continue. And within those landscapes within which red squirrels live, management can still happen. This is not a block on management between February and September. And we've had foresters have been involved in the development of this guidance as well. So we've sought their advice on the applicability of this guidance.
Rebecca, Joe has posed a question about broadleaf species to encourage the colonisation of reds, and of course that is a sensitive issue. So perhaps I'll hand that over to you, Rebecca, just to talk about the planting of broadleafs, particularly where we know we have areas of grey and red coming together.
Yeah. So at the moment, our guidance is that is based around the supporting the survival of red squirrels. So we know that squirrels really thrive in mixed habitats and can live well in broadleaf habitats, but they're not able to outcompete grey squirrels as easily in those habitats. So we, within the red squirrel area, we discourage any large seeded broadleaf species, so oak, hazel, chestnuts, from being planted in those areas, because that can act as an incursion route and support grey squirrel populations. But there, within the species list, there are other broadleaf trees that you can introduce into woodlands that wouldn't be a particular benefit to grey squirrels. They're not especially a benefit to red squirrels either. And that is a challenge. We know that sort of pure conifer habitats are not the prime habitats for red squirrels. But the key to it all really is having really good grey squirrel control. And if you are certain that the grey squirrels are managed, then a small proportion of the larger cedar species is generally considered safe. And I've seen pine marten pop up. I think at the moment, our pine martens are very much in the exploratory, expanding phase. In England, we haven't seen the same population crashes that have been observed in Ireland, and in areas where the pine martens reach those population densities, and we do see populations of grey squirrels crash, then yeah, we'll be able to think about different ways of conserving red squirrels and thinking about different types of forest management in those areas, but not yet. There's a question about are Norway spruce cones higher calorific value compared to other conifer cones? Well, we know that Norway spruce is a preferred habitat. I don't know about the calorific value. I think there was some work done on that. I'll dig it out if I can for you, if you're really interested, Dan. but generally speaking, larger seeded species will have higher calorific value.
And the key thing there, as we sort of touched on in the presentation, Rebecca, is the need for sort of diversity. And in the appendices, you'll see information on the sort of coning characteristics of different coniferous species.
So I'm scrolling back through the questions. Someone's asked about if there's a central database for grey squirrel management, rangers who'll shoot within woodlands. If you're within a red squirrel area, I would recommend you get in touch with the local group that covers that area. They will be able to, if you're interested in volunteering, put you in to make sure you're trained and suitable and find a place for you to manage, support that management. Or if you are looking for support in your grey squirrel management, they'll be able to help you with the best way to do it and perhaps provide you with volunteers who can help you, depending on where you are. But that would be the place I would start. Got a hand up from James. Can you put your question in the chat? Molly's asked a question about tree safety, when it might cause damage or disturbance. That's outside the scope of this guidance, really. But as far as I'm aware, you are able to do actions that for felling a tree that's causing a safety issue, you can apply for a license to fell that tree that will take account of any other issues around it. And that's one of the only exceptions where you can get a license for felling that might cause damage. Jay, have I missed anything through the questions?
Just been scanning through, Rebecca. I think we've picked up the majority. If we do miss any, we will endeavour to look through and provide a response outside of the meeting.
So Ian's asked a question about Forestry England. Obviously, Jay and I don't represent Forestry England, but Forestry England were represented and part of the drafting group. So and I know that there are various colleagues on the call, so they are receiving some training and awareness raising as you are now. What they are planning in terms of their training for staff, I don't know, but in terms of within the UK Squirrel Accord, we're working together to make more training available on all aspects, particularly around grey squirrel management. And this guidance will be part of that as well.
And both the North England Forest District and the South England Forest District of Forestry England provided input into the development of the guidance, both the operational foresters and their ecology team.
So this guidance has been provided to all our staff to read. It's as applicable to any forest manager. So it's the guidance that applies in terms of protecting red squirrels. So where we are considering management activities, this guidance applies. I'm not sure what else I could say to that question. And Jay's shared some tools in the chat, both on future species selection and future resilience. So if you're looking at alternative tree species, there's some additional sort of complementary tools available to you there.
Rebecca, we've had a question on agri-environment schemes. Can WS3 be separated from the need for a WD2 under countryside stewardship?
Not currently. So WS, for those who don't know, WS3 is Woodland Supplement 3 that supports grey squirrel management. And WD2 is the option that supports woodland, good quality woodland management. At the moment, if you enter into a countryside stewardship agreement for woodland, you generally take a base option, which is WD2, that has various requirements around it, and you can add the supplement on top. At the moment, you have to have the supplement on top of a woodland management option. We are looking at options to separate those out in the new schemes that are coming forward. We've made that proposal. That's up for discussion and will be decided upon by DEFRA and those running this scheme. So it is certainly something we are considering, and we're working out whether that can be delivered through countryside stewardship. So yeah, that is a question we're looking to make available to facilitate landscape scale management in particular.
Rebecca, Eddie Cruikshank's made a very valid point about the compromises that sometimes need to be made in forest management decisions, for instance, influenced by weather, and the importance that, as you alluded to in the presentation, of actually writing down and noting any changes to sort of decision making and keeping a record of why those sort of deviations, changes to the plan were actually made.
Yeah, it's really important to maintain that flexibility and think about what you're doing in the face of what actually you see in front of you. Yeah, so there's a question about recreational events. I only really touched on that, and it's really, the guidance is just asking people to be mindful about the potential for disturbance impacts. So it recommends not holding those during peak seasons or near core habitat, the main protected areas. So it's about applying those same principles of the scale of the operation, whether it's a recreational event or a forestry management event, the location of it, where it is, and what time of year it's happening. So it's applying those same principles. And yes, the presentation and recording will be made available. It will be circulated through our e-alert after the event. Okay. Well, thank you all for your attention, and thank you for your questions. If anyone has anything they'd like to follow up with afterwards, they can contact me through the Forestry Commission. And as I said, this will be circulated afterwards, so you'll have the chance to go back over anything that you wanted to check, and we'll make sure those links are available separately as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks, folks.